My girlfriend's coworkers convinced her to fake a breakup to make me chase her again like when we first met. What she didn't know was that I had already been planning to propose that weekend and had her dream ring hidden in my sock drawer. 3 days later, her best friend called me drunk, laughing about their brilliant plan and asking why I wasn't fighting harder. The whole thing started about 8 months ago when Sarah and I had been together for 2.5 years, and I genuinely thought we were building something real, something permanent, the kind of relationship that people write songs about. We'd moved in together 6 months earlier to a beautiful apartment downtown that we'd spent weeks decorating together, arguing playfully over throw pillows and whether we needed that expensive coffee machine that she insisted would change our lives. Spoiler alert, it did change our lives, just not in the way either of us expected. Sarah worked at this trendy marketing firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone was always networking and posting inspirational quotes on LinkedIn about crushing their goals and living their best lives. Her coworkers were a tight-knit group of women in their mid to late 20s who seemed to treat dating like some kind of strategic business venture. They had weekly happy hours where they dissected their relationships with the intensity of a corporate board meeting, and they all seemed to have very strong opinions about how everyone else should be managing their love lives. I'd met most of them at various work events and social gatherings, and while they seemed nice enough on the surface, there was always this underlying competitiveness between them, like they were constantly measuring their relationships against each other's, seeing who had the most romantic boyfriend, who got the most expensive gifts, who had the most dramatic love story to share at their Friday afternoon wine sessions. The ringleader of this group was definitely Amanda, Sarah's closest work friend and the self-proclaimed relationship expert of the office. Amanda was one of those people who had read every dating book ever written, followed every relationship guru on social media, and had very specific theories about how men and women were supposed to interact in romantic relationships. She was constantly giving Sarah advice about our relationship, most of which I found either manipulative or just plain weird. Amanda had been married for 3 years to a guy named Derek who, from what I could tell, spent most of his time trying to keep up with her elaborate relationship games and tests. I'd met Derek a few times at work parties, and he always looked exhausted, like he was constantly walking on eggshells trying to figure out what Amanda wanted from him at any given moment. But according to Amanda, their marriage was perfect because Derek still brought her flowers every Friday and planned surprise date nights and basically treated her like they were still in the early stages of dating rather than an established couple. The other women in the group all seemed to worship Amanda's relationship wisdom and were constantly asking her for advice about their own dating lives. She had opinions about everything from how long you should wait to text someone back, to what you should wear on different types of dates, to how often you should have serious conversations about the future of your relationship. What bothered me most about Amanda's influence on Sarah was how she seemed to view relationships as some kind of power struggle where the goal was to maintain the upper hand rather than building genuine partnership and intimacy. She was always talking about keeping men interested by being unpredictable, about making them work for your attention, about never letting them get too comfortable because comfort apparently led to complacency and the death of romance. Sarah had always been pretty independent and confident before she started working at that company, but over the months I noticed her becoming more and more influenced by Amanda's theories. She started analyzing our relationship through this weird lens of relationship psychology that seemed to come straight from Amanda's playbook. She'd make comments about how we were getting too comfortable, too settled, too predictable, and she worried that the spark was fading. I tried to reassure her that feeling comfortable and settled wasn't a bad thing, that it meant we trusted each other and were building something stable and lasting. But she seemed convinced that comfort was the enemy of passion, that we needed to keep things exciting and uncertain to maintain that butterflies in your stomach feeling from when we first started dating. The irony was that I still felt incredibly passionate about Sarah even after 2.5 years together. I still got excited when I heard her key in the door at the end of the day. I still found excuses to touch her when we were cooking dinner together. I still felt lucky every morning when I woke up next to her. But apparently the fact that I wasn't constantly pursuing her like some lovesick teenager meant that our relationship was becoming stagnant. Things came to a head in early November. Sarah had been acting strange for about a week, coming home from work with this distracted, worried expression, spending more time than usual texting with her coworkers, and asking me weird hypothetical questions about our relationship like what would you do if I said I needed space? Or do you think people can love each other too much? I assumed she was just stressed about work. She'd been putting in long hours on a big campaign, and I figured the relationship questions were probably just her way of processing whatever relationship drama was happening with her coworkers. They were always dealing with some kind of romantic crisis that required extensive group analysis and strategic planning. Then came that Friday evening, the evening that changed everything. I'd had a particularly good day at work. I'm a software engineer at a tech startup, and we'd just successfully launched a major update that I'd been working on for months. I was feeling accomplished and excited to celebrate with Sarah, maybe order takeout from our favorite Thai place and binge watch something mindless on Netflix. I'd also been carrying around a secret that was making me practically vibrate with excitement. I'd finally pulled the trigger on buying an engagement ring, something I'd been thinking about for months. The ring was hidden in my sock drawer, wrapped in a small velvet box that I checked on obsessively every morning before work just to make sure it was still there. The ring wasn't just any ring, it was Sarah's dream ring, something she'd mentioned casually about 6 months earlier when we'd walked past a jewelry store window. She'd stopped and pointed at this vintage-style oval diamond with a delicate band and said something like, "Wow, that's gorgeous, that's exactly the kind of ring I'd want someday if I ever got married." I'd made a mental note of every detail, then spent weeks researching similar rings, visiting different jewelers, and finally finding the perfect one at an estate jewelry shop across town. It had cost me $8,000, which was more than I'd ever spent on anything besides my car, but it felt worth it for the look I imagined on Sarah's face when I proposed. My plan was to propose the following weekend. I'd already made reservations at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, and I'd been rehearsing my speech in my head for weeks. I was nervous but excited, ready to take the next step with the woman I was absolutely certain I wanted to spend my life with. So when Sarah came home that Friday evening with tears in her eyes and that familiar worried expression magnified times 10, my first thought was that something terrible had happened at work or with her family. I immediately went into comfort mode, asking what was wrong, pulling her into a hug, and trying to figure out how I could help. That's when she delivered the speech that turned my world upside down. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our relationship, and she wasn't sure we were right for each other anymore. She said she felt like we'd become more like roommates than lovers, that the excitement and passion had faded, and she wasn't sure if it could be recovered. She said she thought we needed to take a break, give each other some space to figure out what we really wanted. I was completely blindsided. I thought we were happy. I thought we were building something beautiful together. I thought we were on the same page about our future. The idea that she'd been feeling disconnected and unsatisfied while I'd been planning our engagement felt like a punch to the gut. I begged her to reconsider, asked if we could work on things together, suggested couples counseling or a romantic getaway or whatever it would take to fix whatever was broken. But she insisted that her mind was made up, that she needed time alone to think, and that trying to fix things right now would just be putting a band-aid on deeper issues. She packed a bag that night and went to stay with Amanda, which should have been my first clue that something was off, but I was too devastated to think clearly. I spent the entire weekend in a haze, alternating between heartbreak and confusion, trying to figure out where everything had gone wrong, replaying our recent conversations looking for signs I'd missed. I called in sick to work on Monday, unable to focus on anything besides the fact that my life had imploded over the weekend. I kept thinking about the ring in my sock drawer, about the restaurant reservation I'd have to cancel, about the future I'd been planning that was now completely uncertain. The worst part was how final everything felt. Sarah hadn't said this was temporary or that she just needed a few days to think. She'd said she wasn't sure we were right for each other, which sounded like the kind of thing people say when they're preparing to break up permanently. I found myself wondering if there was someone else, if she'd been unhappy for longer than she'd let on, if I'd been completely delusional about the state of our relationship. By Tuesday I was starting to accept that it might really be over. I spent hours online reading about how to move forward after a serious breakup, how to rebuild your life when your future plans get completely derailed. I even started looking at smaller apartments, figuring I'd probably need to move out of our place that held too many memories. That's when Amanda called me Wednesday evening around 9 o'clock, clearly drunk and giggling in that particular way that drunk people giggle when they think they're being clever. She started the conversation by asking why I wasn't fighting harder for Sarah, why I hadn't shown up at her apartment with flowers or written her love letters or done any of the romantic gestures that men in movies do when they're trying to win back the love of their life. I told her that Sarah had been very clear about needing space and that I was trying to respect her wishes, but Amanda just laughed harder and said something about how men never understand what women really want even when we spell it out for them. She said that when women say they need space, they don't actually want space, they want their boyfriends to prove how much they care by refusing to give them space. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. She said, "Don't worry, this whole thing was our idea. Sarah didn't really want to break up with you. She just wanted to make you chase her again like when you first met. We thought if she pulled back, you'd step up and start being romantic again instead of just being comfortable all the time." I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. Amanda continued talking, explaining how they'd come up with this brilliant plan during their Friday happy hour session, how they'd convinced Sarah that relationships needed periodic shakeups to stay exciting, how they'd assured her that I'd come running the moment she threatened to leave and that our relationship would be stronger than ever once I proved how much I was willing to fight for her. According to Amanda, the plan was supposed to last maybe 3 or 4 days, just long enough for me to panic and start grand romantic gestures that would remind Sarah why she fell in love with me in the first place. They'd apparently spent hours strategizing about what Sarah should say, how long she should stay away, and what kind of response they expected from me. But instead of playing along with their script, I'd respected Sarah's stated wishes and given her the space she'd asked for, which according to Amanda proved that I didn't really care about her that much, because men who truly love their girlfriends don't just let them walk away without a fight. I was so angry I could barely speak. Amanda was still giggling obliviously, continuing to explain their brilliant relationship psychology and how disappointed they all were that I hadn't risen to the occasion the way they'd expected. When I finally found my voice, I asked her if she had any idea how devastating the past few days had been for me, if she understood that I'd been planning to propose to Sarah that weekend. The giggling stopped. Amanda went quiet for a moment, then tried to backtrack, saying she'd had no idea I was planning to propose. "That changes everything." She said this was supposed to be fun, supposed to bring us closer together, not actually threaten our relationship. She started apologizing profusely, but the damage was done. I hung up on her and sat in our apartment staring at the walls, feeling a combination of rage and betrayal that I'd never experienced before. The woman I'd been planning to marry had manipulated me into days of emotional agony based on the advice of her coworkers who treated relationships like some kind of strategic game. The fact that it was all fake, that none of her concerns about our relationship were real, somehow made it worse, not better. I realized in that moment that even if Sarah came back, even if she apologized and tried to explain, I would never be able to trust her again. She'd been willing to put me through hell for the sake of some twisted relationship experiment. She'd valued the opinions of her coworkers over the stability of our relationship. She'd treated my emotions like they were disposable. That night I took the engagement ring out of my sock drawer and stared at it for a long time, thinking about the future I'd been planning, the life we could have had together if she'd just been honest with me about whatever concerns she had instead of turning to Amanda's manipulation playbook. I wrapped the ring back up and put it in my jacket pocket. The next morning I drove to the jewelry store and returned it. The owner was sympathetic when I explained that the proposal wasn't happening anymore, and he gave me a full refund minus a small restocking fee. $8,000 back in my account, money that I'd saved specifically for our future that now represented my freedom from a relationship built on games and manipulation. I spent the next few days blocking Sarah on all social media platforms, changing the locks on our apartment since her name wasn't on the lease, and packing up her belongings to leave with the building's concierge. I wrote her a single text message explaining that Amanda had told me about their plan, that I knew the breakup was fake, and that as far as I was concerned, it was now real. Her response was immediate and panicked, a flood of texts and calls trying to explain that it wasn't what it seemed like, that she'd realized it was a mistake almost immediately, that she'd been planning to come home anyway and tell me the truth. She said she loved me, that she wanted to work things out, that Amanda had pressured her into something she never should have agreed to. But I was done. I'd seen behind the curtain and learned that the woman I'd planned to marry was willing to emotionally manipulate me based on advice from people who treated relationships like strategic games. I couldn't imagine building a future with someone who demonstrated such a fundamental lack of respect for my feelings. The final piece of my revenge came together about 2 weeks later when I ran into Sarah's younger sister Emma at a coffee shop near my office. Emma had always been the complete opposite of Sarah, genuine, straightforward, and refreshingly honest about her feelings and intentions. We'd always gotten along well during family gatherings but had never spent much time together one-on-one. Emma had heard about our breakup from Sarah, who according to Emma had been an emotional wreck ever since realizing that her manipulation had backfired spectacularly. Emma said Sarah had been crying constantly, calling in sick to work, and generally falling apart as the reality of losing me sank in. As we talked over coffee, I found myself genuinely enjoying Emma's company in a way that felt completely different from my relationship with Sarah. There were no games, no hidden agendas, no analysis of every word and gesture, just honest conversation between two people who found each other interesting and attractive. When Emma asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime, I said yes, not because I was trying to get back at Sarah, but because I genuinely wanted to spend more time with someone who seemed to value honesty and direct communication over manipulation and mind games. Our first date was everything my relationship with Sarah had stopped being: exciting, unpredictable, and filled with genuine curiosity about each other. Emma was studying to be a veterinarian and had stories about her work with animals that were both hilarious and heartwarming. She asked thoughtful questions about my job and seemed genuinely interested in my answers rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. By our third date, I realized I was falling for someone who was everything I'd thought I wanted in Sarah before Amanda's influence had poisoned our relationship with games and artificial drama. Emma was confident without being manipulative, intelligent without being calculating, and passionate without needing to create fake problems to generate excitement. The first time Sarah found out I was dating Emma was through a mutual friend who'd seen us together at a restaurant. Sarah called Emma immediately, demanding to know what was going on, how Emma could betray her like this, and whether this was some kind of elaborate revenge plot against her. Emma's response was classic Emma, direct, honest, and completely without apology. She told Sarah that she and I were both adults capable of making our own dating decisions, that Sarah had given up any claim to my emotional loyalty when she'd chosen to play games with our relationship, and that if Sarah had wanted to keep me, she should have treated me better when she had the chance. The family drama that followed was intense. Sarah tried to get their parents involved, painting Emma as a traitor who'd stolen her sister's boyfriend, but Emma had already told them the whole story about Sarah's fake breakup plan and Amanda's manipulation, so their sympathy was somewhat limited. Sarah's coworkers were apparently divided on the situation. Amanda insisted that Sarah's only mistake had been not executing their plan correctly, while some of the other women began to question whether Amanda's relationship advice was actually helpful or just designed to create drama for entertainment. The last I heard, Sarah had quit her job at the marketing firm and was seeing a therapist to work through what she described as her tendency to overcomplicate relationships and listen to bad advice from people who didn't have her best interests at heart. As for Emma and me, we've been together for 8 months now, and everything feels easy in the way that healthy relationships should feel. We communicate directly when we have concerns, we don't need artificial drama to keep things exciting, and we're building something based on trust and genuine compatibility rather than games and manipulation. I still have moments where I think about what might have happened if Sarah had just been honest with me about her concerns, if she'd suggested couples counseling or a romantic getaway instead of listening to Amanda's advice about creating fake problems to solve. But mostly I feel grateful that her manipulation revealed her true character before I made the mistake of proposing. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic, it's just living well and finding someone who treats you with the respect and honesty you deserve. Emma never tries to make me chase her because she knows I'm already choosing her every day, and that makes all the difference in the world.